Good afternoon. Thanks for sticking with us into this final session. Just to echo what Chris said, I think that Ryan gave a really great overview of this issue, which, now we can kind of look a little bit more at other aspects of it, and there'll be some similar themes that I'll touch on, quite a few in my presentation, but with that sort of more gendered lens to it. So this is the research team. From the AIC, it's myself, Samantha Lynham, and Christopher Dowling. And the research was commissioned by the Regional Support Office of the Bali Process, and particular shout out to the awesome teamwork between us and Ryan and Lindsay from the RSO, who have just been great to work with and have been really critical in getting us the access that we've needed to be able to do this work. We also want to acknowledge Kane Tanaka from UN Women, who was instrumental, particularly in the initial stages of this research, and also recognise the technical support provided by UN Women throughout the development of the project. So, as Ryan has clearly outlined, over the past decade, cyber scam centres dedicated to running online scams at a massive scale have really expanded across areas of Southeast Asia. And a massive workforce is required to fuel this industry, with a proportion of this workforce being comprised of people who are being held against their will after having been trafficked for the purpose of forced criminality. Now, alongside these scams, which affect victims globally, these centres themselves have become significant sites of exploitation of women and girls. Historically, women and girls constitute the majority of trafficking survivors overall, and certainly the majority of victim survivors of sex trafficking are women. In scam centres, the majority of workers and victims trafficked in for scamming roles are men. However, women who are trafficked into cyber scam centres experience a number of unique risks and challenges that deserve further attention. And the extent to which gender is shaping pathways into and experiences of exploitation in this context is only just beginning to be explored. So our research aimed to look into how gender shapes victim experiences of forced criminality in cyber scam centres in Southeast Asia. And we were interested in how technology is being used in this context, how it's being used and by whom, as well as what kind of lessons we can learn from really exploring and trying to understand these gender dynamics that can inform prevention and intervention. With the support of our project partners connecting us through their networks and to events in the region, we've managed to consult with 86 stakeholders who have experience or knowledge of this topic and the relevant gendered dynamics. Data was collected through 3 focus groups in Bangkok, Chiang Mai and Manila in late 2024. And we also conducted in-depth interviews with experts and stakeholders, both from government and non-government sectors. 3 in-depth interviews were conducted with victim survivors with lived experience of forced criminality in cyber scam centres in Southeast Asia, including 2 adult women and 1 adult man, whose countries of origin were Uganda, Sri Lanka and South Africa. So today I'm going to focus on our findings around women's pathways into scam centres, their roles and experiences when they're inside, and their exit out, as well as some of the implications of this research for intervention and response. So one of the key themes in this research was that women are more likely to be recruited by someone that they know or have a pre-existing relationship with. And this trend was interpreted as exploiting social and emotional trust, as well as reflecting an increased hesitation among women to answer an online job ad and then travel alone across a border for work. The trafficker is usually someone from the victim's own community, such as a work colleague, a boyfriend, a friend, a family member, or an acquaintance, that betrays them and misleads them about the nature of the work. The relationship between the recruiter and the trafficking target can be familial, platonic, or romantic. So the seduction recruitment tactic appears to be a quite common pathway in for girls who are dating adult men online. So we heard reports of girls entering into cyber scam centres after being recruited by men posing as romantic partners in exclusively online relationships. And this evidence that women are potentially more likely to be recruited through personal networks while men are more likely to be recruited through online job advertisements may reflect traffickers' strategic efforts to exploit stereotypically gendered motivations and vulnerabilities, such as women relying more on relationships to inform significant life decisions. While less common, women are also being trafficked into scam compounds through fake job advertisements. So this occurs when a victim applies for a fake job online, often through mainstream social media platforms such as Facebook, LinkedIn, WeChat, or Telegram. This image on the screen is taken from Interpol, who highlight an evolution in the requirements outlined in these job ads, from light job or simple job with high salary to more skilled professional roles and targeted profiles. So you can see the models, European preferred, that's referring to the role of the model, which is more or less exclusively for women in scam centres, and I'm going to elaborate on this a little bit more in a moment. Some of these ads are quite clearly fake and have consistent patterns in the information in them, whereas others are indistinguishable from legitimate job opportunities. And you can really find a mix of both types of ads online. Several stakeholders spoke about women who applied for a marketing job based in Bangkok before being trafficked into a scam compound. 2 of the 3 victims that we spoke to had been recruited through an online job ad. One, however, had been referred to that job ad through a friend. So you can really see the crossover between online job ads and personal networks in that case. Not all scam centre workers are deceived about the nature, purpose and location of the work. However, a significant proportion of those who enter willingly are subsequently coerced, exploited and tricked, such as when they're subject to abuse or prevented from freely leaving. In terms of women's experiences inside cyber scam centres, women experience varied and compounded forms of exploitation in this context. Themes relating to women's experiences centred around their role as scammers, models, and in service and support roles, the blurred lines between sex work and sexual exploitation, as well as significant sexual violence and coercion. We also looked at their presence in leadership roles, and I'll now go into each of these themes in a bit more detail. Unsurprisingly, a common form of exploitation experienced by women in this context is forced criminality, particularly involvement in online scamming. Roles are differentiated by the scamming process. Women often have the task of making initial contact with men over dating apps and on social media, and also being the face or voice on phone calls and video calls with fraud victims. A common scam, the romance investment scam, is gendered by nature. The scammer impersonates a love interest and builds trust with the fraud target over time before encouraging them to invest in a fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme. Men are the primary focus of romance scams, but people of all gender and sexual identities are being targeted. Men often pretend to be women online, as most fraud targets are men, while women rarely pretend to be men. However, both women and men can assume identities that can be male or female, as workers are given guidebooks which outline how to approach conversations with potential scam targets depending on the profile of the fraud victim and the characteristics of the person that they're pretending to be. So one example of this might be that they're targeting an older, rich, lonely woman and they're pretending to be a US soldier deployed overseas. Aside from these manuals, workers also receive training using AI models to support conversations, as Ryan was talking about before. So this includes generating appropriate responses, again, depending on the characteristics of the person they're targeting and who they're pretending to be, as well as translating messages into different languages. So this really helps scammers to transcend traditional gender and language barriers in communication, as well as allow a man to believably portray a woman online in a conversation with a male fraud target. If the fraud target becomes suspicious, a call with a model is scheduled to reassure the fraud target that their relationship and the investment are real. So the model is the voice and the face of the scam operation and the romance scam in particular. If the fraud target wants a phone or video call, the model will be briefed on the relationship by the scammers who have been impersonating the love interest, and they'll be told exactly what they need to do or say to convince the target that the relationship is real and get them to make the transfer. Many of the targets of the romance scams are wealthy East Asian, North American, European, and Australian and Canadian men who are looking for physically attractive women from Central and Southeast Asian, Eastern European and Middle Eastern countries. This role was described by some stakeholders and victims as potentially a bit easier than some of the other roles that victims have in scam centres, such as scamming and sex work. Stakeholders spoke about how models have more privileges and freedom than other women and men within cyber scam centres, so they're allowed to leave. They're allowed to go and get their hair and nails done. They're allowed to go shopping. They're less likely to associate with other scammers. They were described as having more stake in the game and being paid more, being more willing. They're also less likely to be subjected to violence due to the need to maintain a certain appearance. Several stakeholders describe the use of AI to help scammers assume the role of models. So deepfake technology, again, as Ryan touched on, the use of AI to digitally alter voices, images and video is increasingly being used, as this provides a mechanism through which male scammers can pretend to be women when communicating with fraud victims or support the creation of fake profiles online. And several stakeholders commented on how the quality and sophistication of this technology has been improving rapidly and is likely to continue to be used more and more in scamming. All right. Our research found that women disproportionately occupied gendered work roles related to catering, cleaning and caregiving. So these can be standalone roles, or they can be roles that women occupy in addition to other roles that they have, such as scamming. The gendered nature of this work means that women experience multiple and concurrent forms of exploitation that men are less likely to experience, and this reflects entrenched gendered hierarchies and norms characteristic of the region. There were several reports of women being involved in transportation of victims, such as driving victims from the airport in Bangkok to their accommodation and then over the border from Thailand into the neighbouring country where the scam centre was, so Thailand or Myanmar. It's notable that these forms of service work, such as victim transportation, catering and receptionist roles, are all public-facing roles. Some stakeholders said that women may be strategically positioned to provide a more trustworthy or approachable face for criminal operations. And by design, they're absorbing disproportionate levels of risk of detection in these roles. Women's experiences of sexual violence and exploitation in cyber scam centres are complex and shaped by the nature of this coercive environment. Threats of sexual violence are a common strategy used to control women in cyber scam centres. So this includes threatening sexual harm as punishment for not meeting scamming targets or performing or behaving, as well as threats of being re-trafficked into sexual servitude. And there was evidence that these are not empty threats and that this is happening with examples of cases where women had been re-trafficked multiple times before they had been rescued across different forms of sexual exploitation and forced criminality. Women and girls in cyber scam centres experience the risk of violence and sexual harm from men at all operational levels, so from other workers and scammers and victims to managers and leaders. Multiple stakeholders reported an increase in women entering into relationships with men for protection or being coerced into relationships initiated by male bosses or other victims as a way to survive in this high-risk environment. Sex work exists as a side industry to scamming, with brothels and massage parlours operating within and nearby cyber scam centres. Sexual services are available to men in management and leadership roles. However, male scammers are also incentivised to meet scamming targets and comply with work demands with rewards of sexual services. Women and girls, often from China, Myanmar and Thailand, are being trafficked in specifically to work in brothels and massage facilities that operate alongside the scam industry. And some women are incentivised to undertake sex work within cyber scam centres, and motivated by the financial gains, they fly in and out specifically to do this work. These women are hard to access, and we have limited information about their experiences. Consistent with the lower levels of the scam labour force, it is mostly men who occupy management and leadership positions in cyber scam centres. There was evidence that women are more likely to be given positions as recruiters, as this exploits stereotypes around women appearing more trustworthy, and is also related to their roles in transportation and as receptionists, as I discussed earlier. Outside of recruiters, there was little evidence of women holding positions of authority. The majority of victim survivors refer to male managers or bosses, and when women are in charge or described as being in charge, it's usually as like a team leader or a supervisor of a team. However, there have been some high-profile examples of women holding leadership positions, such as Alice Go on the left-hand side of the screen here, who was the mayor of a town in the Philippines, who was recently sentenced to life in prison for her part after being convicted of human trafficking in connection with an offshore gambling operation or a scam centre in her town. The other image includes members of the Ming family, 11 of whom were recently sentenced to death and executed in China for their part running a notorious scam centre in northern Myanmar. Ming Juan, the woman pictured standing trial there, is the daughter of the patriarch of this particular crime family. In many high-profile cases, women's presence within the upper ranks is often linked to a family or romantic relationship with a male co-offender. Stakeholders often interpreted women's leadership as lacking agency, assuming criminal responsibility in a more supportive capacity rather than holding actual authority and power. The key ways that women leave cyber scam centres is mostly the same as men, except for one obvious route out, which is pregnancy. Women are often allowed to leave when they near the full term of their pregnancy, as they're seen as a liability, and scam syndicates don't want to pay their hospital bills or care for them in postpartum. If they can't work 16 hours a day, then they're not worth keeping and feeding. We didn't hear any stories of women escaping, and stakeholders suggested that women were unlikely to proactively reach out for rescue. There are significant risks involved in reaching out for rescue, and they said it was usually a man who did this, who reached out on behalf of a group. They would have the phone, that they would be communicating with the outside world and have the risk of having that phone. And the group usually included people of the same nationality. Diplomatic intervention is inconsistently occurring, but happens when a victim survivor manages to contact someone on the outside, like an NGO or law enforcement, with a request for rescue, which is then relayed to their relevant embassy. But often they can't be rescued because police are not cooperative or unavailable, or they don't have diplomatic links in the country in which they're being held, or the embassy is not responsive, which happens. Victims may leave by paying their ransom or debt, but which may be the cost of the initial investment by the scam centre to get them there. So this might be the cost of their flights and their visa, as well as additional expenses that they accrue during their time inside. And these can be quite arbitrary and quite significant. They may be able to raise funds from family and friends back home if they have been paid a wage. As Ryan said, this happens sometimes, and they may need to use all of this to secure their own release. So even when they are paid a wage, they always leave with nothing. There were lots of reports of victims simply refusing to work. However, in these cases, people are often physically and sexually abused, tortured, re-trafficked multiple times before they're sort of let go. So even though we did hear about this happening quite a lot, and I think multiple of the victims that we spoke to reported this, it's definitely not an easy way out in any way. Another way that victim survivors are exiting cyber scam centres is by recruiting another person to take their place. And it's unclear how common this is, but it's another example of how victim survivors are coerced to engage in criminal activity in cyber scam centres and how victims of trafficking can graduate to becoming traffickers themselves as a way to escape their own experience of exploitation. Okay, the themes relating to intervention and response centred around prevention and education, support needs of women and girls, institutional and legal responses, and victim identification. So there is a need for engaging, tailored and grassroots prevention and awareness campaigns that target outreach to at-risk groups and communities with a focus on local trends and the gendered nature of recruitment practices. For small communities at risk, these campaigns need to be locally driven and run. There are some examples of effective campaigns focused on both this form of trafficking and also other forms of trafficking like child bride trafficking that have been effective in the region and that can inform these efforts and future efforts. Stakeholders highlighted the lack of psychosocial support provided to women and all victims post-exit. Women also continue to be at continued risk of sexual violence in shelters, and for this reason they're often taken to women-only shelters, which may be in remote areas and where access to support is even more limited. Shelters function as an important triage point, and there's a need to increase the number of qualified social workers and relevant professionals who can provide trauma-informed support in this context. Having more female police officers at shelters was seen as an important step towards providing a more gender-sensitive response. Institutional and legal responses are similar for men and women and include things like improving broader screening processes, developing a shared definition of trafficking for forced criminality across the region, and continuing to responsibilise tech companies and improve information sharing between NGOs, government and police. Lastly, the proportion of willing participants makes victim identification challenging. However, it's necessary to recognise the high level of overlap between perpetration and victimisation in this context and the relevance of the non-punishment principle here. Thailand has the most established or structured approach to victim identification in the region through its national referral mechanism. However, there is regional variability, a lot of regional variability in the availability of victim identification and a lack of trauma-informed practice such as safe spaces to facilitate disclosures of sexual violence. Best practice was described as having a multidisciplinary team with both men and women as well as a gender-based violence specialist. Having a consistent or shared definition of forced criminality across the region was described as an important step towards improving victim identification and dealing with some of these challenges. To sum up, our findings highlight how victim survivor experiences in cyber scam centres in Southeast Asia are shaped by gendered recruitment pathways, role allocation, and patterns of exploitation. Relational trust is being used to traffic victims for forced criminality, especially women, as well as perpetrate scams against fraud targets online. Women have a critical role in operations as models and avatars, and technology is potentially providing new ways of overcoming the need for human women to occupy these roles. We know that many women and girls are subject to clear and extreme forms of sexual violence in cyber scam centres, including coercive relationships. And there are not an insignificant number of women who engage in sex work in this setting that can be voluntary. But they engage in this work under conditions of structural inequality and where the lines between consent, coercion and survival are blurred. I'll finish by saying we hope that by improving understanding of these gender differences, vulnerabilities and support needs, we can contribute to the development of more targeted, appropriate prevention and intervention for all victims. Thank you.